Thanks everyone for joining. We got folks still filtering in. So while we're doing that, I'll just go ahead with some introductions here. Um, we got a really good topic to talk about today. So I'm Peter. I'm the CEO and also a partner here at Anania Bailey, joined by Dustin, our accounts director, also a partner here, and Nick, our creative director as well. We have some ground rules just to go over. We love when people have their camera on. We're a little light on attendees today because everyone is on vacation. Everyone asked for the replay because we're coming right up on the school year, so a lot of people are out on vacation. But for folks that are here, please, if you can, put your cameras on. It just lets us see you a little bit more interactive. If you have a question at any time, you want to come on and speak to us, just raise your hand using Zoom. Also, you can use the chat feature as well. And when you have the question, just pop it in. Don't feel like you got to wait till the end. We like this to be a little bit of a two-way conversation. And with that in mind, we'll just kind of go in. I asked for Nick to create a challenge slide, and Nick, I got to say, I love all the slides, and I know you did some customization with this one, but I love the slides for this presentation. I really just wanted to start us off by setting the stage here, getting our juices flowing a little bit. Nick and Dustin, they've got a great presentation that they're going to be going over, and I just kind of picked out some things I wanted to talk about just to frame the challenge a little bit. And that is, why is it really important to rebrand the right way, and why did we come up with this title? Please don't rebrand like Elon. And the first thing that came to mind, and Dustin's going to talk about this a little bit further, is rebranding. It's a big financial and time investment, so it's important to do it proper. You're investing in a creative, a very high quality creative team to help you with the branding effort, but it's also a big time investment with your team, with your marketing team, and with your executives as well. So when you're doing a rebrand, it's really important in that way to do it properly and get it right the first way. And Dustin's got a lot on this, which is great, and he's going to be talking about. But there's this notion of goodwill. When we look at financial statements of publicly traded companies, there's this little line item for goodwill. And what is that? It's not tangible. It's not machinery. It's not assets. It's something intangible, and it's usually a pretty big line item on publicly traded companies. And that's because your brand is a very valuable asset for organizations. So when we are rebranding, it's important that we take it seriously. And then just the last thing, Nick's going to be talking about leadership. He has a lot of experience working with big governmental organizations and for-profit organizations, leading teams. And he's going to talk about leading through a rebrand. And the thing that came to my mind is, there's a challenge of ensuring when you are rebranding that it's not just reflective of one leader, but it's reflective of your target audience. And that's going to be team members, it's going to be consumers, and it's going to possibly even be investors. So, it's certainly a challenge to make sure that you're thinking of all those audiences. So Dustin and Nick, I wanted to go through that quickly. And Dustin, you're gonna dig a little bit more into strategy when we're talking about how Elon rebranded and rebranding in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, we all have our eyes glued to the screens, looking at this rebrand, seeing what's going on over the last 30 days, sort of adapting to how we're using that social media platform, if we were using it, or how we're interacting with it with our brands, our clients. So there's a lot of different things. So like I think it's good to take a step back and kind of ask ourselves, why is Elon even doing this? Is it visionary? Is it reckless? Is it a little self-aggrandizing? Maybe a little bit of each one of those. But I think we have the official line that what he's trying to do with Twitter is to try to build this super app, kind of like what China has with their WeChat app that is a government issue. And this is something that he's kind of dreamed of a long time. Some sort of software or app to sort of conquer them all. And this is sort of the first big step in that direction. And this has been on his mind as far as, as we can kind of look back as, part of the strategy all the way back in April when this decision was to move some of these items forward. So Let's just take a look at a couple of different things over, what we can tell from, an outsider's perspective looking in, and what kind of information we have from them on what kind of strategy is around this rebrand, because I think we're all a little jarred by all the different things that have happened, and, having sort of the one man's will about all this kind of stuff. So let's just take a look and see, brass tacks, what some of this has actually happened. So, the first one is, who needs brand equity? And I think, as we were kind of talking about it, we've been joking here in the office about this entire process over X and Twitter, and having to be able to use the right language around certain things, because, this brand has been around for a long time. It's built nomenclature, it's built culture, it's affected global language. So 15 years of brand value is erased overnight with this kind of strategy, with changing everything to X and X.com. Robert Haig, from the director of brand valuation consultancy at Brand Finance, told Forbes much of Twitter's brand value could have been saved with a carefully managed migration plan or rollout, right? So there are some challenges with, how things have been done, and part of that is coming from the very beginning of like what kind of strategy they're going with on how they're presenting this. And, from all estimations, Elon apparently wiped out between $4 and $20 billion of value in this one move. So really thinking about in terms of what is your brand equity, what is it worth? As a publicly traded company, they had to really think about this, and it might have been a very, very bad idea. So as we're continuing to see how the market changes off of that, you have to think about your brand equity. One thing that we don't have here in all of our bullets, but so it's really important to think about, is like an SEO strategy. So like when we think about SEO, we think about like, how do we get ourselves to the very top of the actual Google listing. But for an organization this size, it's not really that as much as it is, trying to find the right information now is now extremely difficult for the internet to react to it. Like, it's a lot easier to find stuff about what X.com is doing Googling Twitter right now. So it's very difficult to find the right information and try to figure out all these different items that are going on because of this giant shift in language in this rebrand. Peter, you wanted to say something?
I just think it makes it hard to do research on what actually is going on when, I hadn't even thought about that until you brought up that challenge in this respect with SEO.
Yeah. And things that have been sort of set, we don't even think about this, but it has that search engine optimization wealth, that's been built up over 15 years, that's slowly getting destroyed now over the next month. And there is a giant website with millions of embedded tweets across the internet, and now all of those have to be migrated over, and that's thousands of personnel hours that are now being wasted on this flipping the switch kind of tactic that's being used. So that's a huge item that we continue to look at as what's the strategic parts that they have in mind when making this change. And then the next one, we really think about value propositions. So there is no new value in this change. There's been a lot of speculation on there's a new vision, but like there's nothing changing with the service just yet. There's nothing significant on the platform as the day of changing the rebrand. And this promise of a super app is still just, part of that vision, part of that promise that's coming that really hasn't been enacted yet. So we're not seeing the features that are there, and it's kind of the opportunity to show part of that and kickstart it is missing. And then, of course, we can't talk about, strategy about rebranding, and particularly this one, if we don't talk about the legal aspect. So being above the law, not thinking about or openly welcoming trademark legal battles, is either, using your research, either your research is not done or it's done and it's ignored, which is a huge challenge, especially for a lot of, smaller businesses and organizations that can kind of look at this case study and kind of walk away being like, what are some of the things you can learn from it, is to really think about the legal aspect of it. There's 100% chance that Twitter is going to be sued over this by somebody. There's no way to walk away from that. And 900 companies right now have registrations with the letter X, and one of them largest being Microsoft's Xbox series that's had that trademark for the last 23 years roughly, since the brand sort of started. So there's a lot of different contentious parts, but I think the thing that we noticed most above all with all the changes that have been going on with Twitter or X is really the creative ones, the ones we can see and feel and have a sense of when we look at it, right, Nick?
Expertly transitioned, Dustin. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so many of the problems that we're running into are really problems that stem from that creative space. First, I think, and you alluded to this a little bit, was the idea that his rebranding is really abandoning this niche community, right? Twitter has really built a very specific culture and a very kind of vital culture. That companies chase that dragon for the entirety of their existence, trying to find a place where they can get there, right? Tweeting became like, Xerox was interchangeable for copying something, or Googling is what we say when we're going to search something in a search engine. People say tweet even when they don't mean Twitter. We all know what it means to tweet something out. Twitter had fewer users than Facebook or Instagram, even at its peak. And nonetheless, that kind of language has become ubiquitous with the culture and the subculture there. So when you're thinking about a rebrand, if it's me in those shoes, any rebrand needs to inherently tread really lightly to avoid kind of disturbing the elements that have fostered that community and that interaction. It's really fragile. Communities are very fragile, and they're very self-aware, which will come up in a second. So a sweeping rebrand like this probably should have died early in the creative process, to be honest. It might have been, let's change the blue a little bit, let's tweak this. Do we want it to be a bluebird? Maybe we want it to be a mighty eagle because Elon launches rockets into the sky and he wants this to be a beefier bird. Cool. But this X rebrand really kind of leaves a lot of these elements behind. But for the sake of the conversation, because this was the assignment, let's assume that it was a good idea to rebrand. Let's assume that a multi-million-dollar global communications asset needed to be changed. So let's talk about X. That's a problem right off the bat. It was bad ideation. It's never a good idea to start creative with a predetermined outcome, and it's really clear that that's what Elon did. Elon had been pushing for X as a brand since he was ousted from PayPal in the late 90s. He talked about wanting X to be the new brand for PayPal. Then he talked about how he wanted to create a new company called X. This is something that he's been playing with for a couple of decades. So the fact that he kind of selected this new name and brand without actually engaging in this creative process is really problematic. A new name for a brand needs to be two things. This is what success on a rebrand is: cost effective and minimally contentious. Like when you're talking about like the floor of doing this right, like it shouldn't bankrupt you and it shouldn't piss people off. And this has done both. So right off the bat, not a great idea starting from that kind of predetermined location. The second thing is that X is a really troubled brand choice. There's a lot of different letters that we associate with stuff. A for excellence, right? We've all gone to like an A+ car wash in our lifetime, right? X doesn't have great connotations. Brand X is where this stuff started off with. We had Brand X for, I prefer Tide because compared to Brand X, or 9 out of 10 dentists wouldn't agree with blah, blah, blah. That was kind of like part of how we thought about branding, X being a bad thing, for about 70 or 80 years of, I would say, like modern-esque communications, right? From the advent of the radio until the late 70s, when they allowed companies to start to actually identify the other brands. So like we got the Pepsi challenge because we didn't have to call it Brand X anymore. And that was right about the time that we started to use X to determine when something was pornographic. So XXX became a thing, or X-rated became a thing. All of that serves, I mean, I don't want to shame anybody, like nudity is fine, like sex is part of life, but like XXX, seeing that in neon tends to give you a very distinct sense of like something being sketchy, poorly managed, poorly refined. Maybe people associate with other kind of people you would trust. Like that's what X was for about 35 years. And the mid-90s, we tried to embrace X in kind of a different way, as like X being like this extreme thing that we did, right? You had the X Games, you had Vin Diesel in XXX, both of which X Games have since been canceled. XXX did terribly in the box office. Even the Xbox itself, the Xbox was a term that they were using in-house, and that it got leaked and they decided to stick with that brand because it had leaked so widely before Microsoft was able to name the gaming platform. So like all of those things felt a little absurd at the time. All of those things feel dated now. X has never really been a brand that has done terribly well. And then from a visual identity, again, we're going to say, like, let's say the predetermined idea was a good idea, and let's say that X is the way to go. The visual identity is really kind of jumbled too. You kind of have a lack of originality here. If you were to tell me that Elon picked a letter from an Adobe font set and said, this is my logo, I like the way that this font has an X on it, I would believe you. There's not a lot to make this X feel special or unique. The color choices here are really problematic too. This is a trend that isn't just Elon's. This is a trend that like I run into in a buzzsaw with a lot of clients, both kind of locally and nationally, is the sense that like we like black and white. Maybe we add a little bit of gray. It's almost like kind of an abstraction of the concept of minimalism being very classy. People like to stick with black and white. That can work if you are a retail organization and you sell things with color. So Apple's a great example. Apple does a lot of black and white. They still stick to a lot of minimalist stuff, right? Where if they're not doing a big, beautiful picture, it's minimalist with type. All that works fine because everybody wants to know what are the iPhone colors coming out this year, right? There's big splashes of color. They deal with a lot of splashy media. They sell products with color. That's not what's happening on this platform. This platform is either a white or a dark theme, which is black, and then you've got a logo that's white or black. That means that you don't have any of the tools that are associated with a rebrand, right? You don't have the ability to use color or use different fonts to help further engage your clientele or your potential new customers with the brand. You don't have an ability to really separate your brand from anything else. And inherently, it's just going to disappear in the background because about 80% of the things that we interact with on social or on a computer screen are white or black. So it just blends into the brand. And then finally, I just want to reiterate this, like Dustin said, this lack of originality is literally potentially criminal. Right? Because he didn't do the due diligence on here, X presents so many legal issues that it really is turning a rebrand into a liability. And I know that was part of the strategic side, but if you guys are tap dancing in the rebrand side with a creative agency, not all creative agencies are marketing agencies, where I wouldn't say an exception to the rule, but that's not the standard. Demand some of that accountability from any creative team you're working with here is to do some legwork. They're going to say, oh, well, we're not legal experts. That's fine. But there's so many ways that you can check copyrights locally, nationally, in your industries, etc., to be able to cut out stuff that is inherently a bad idea like this. This should have been done at any number of months. So that's enough of me going off kind of like crazy. Not only was it like not great creative, but the execution was jumbled too. Isn't that right, Dustin?
Yes. So I mean, I think that's really where, when we can kind of like see the creative aspect of it, and we can kind of feel the execution. And that's really been the big jarring aspect of it in the last 30 days that we can really examine and learn a lot from. So like, the way that I kind of looked at this, right, is that Elon's strategy is really brute force. Like, what's the most effective part of it? It's the shock value from it. And it's this purposeful change, for a brand owner and not for the audiences, in consideration. And that's everything from the Twitter fans that were already on the platform to advertisers to internal audiences, the people who work at Twitter/X, as we continue to figure out the language barriers and how we continue to try to describe this company and its people. So like everybody likes a surprise. Let's talk about the rollout or lack thereof, because I think there's an argument to be made whether there was a proper rollout or not. And the way that I kind of look at this is sort of the classic fumble with a flipping the switch kind of approach. So instead of having that phased approach, instead of changing it from like it's this type of bird to this type of bird to slowly building what X is going to become, overnight, over one weekend, we get Twitter dead and we have X.com as the next thing. And that's a huge problem. As Robert Haig had said, right, this requires a lot of careful planning and calculation to execute smoothly and roll out to all of these different audiences, and it was just completely ignored. One of the biggest things is thinking about communication. I don't have time to explain all of it. There's a lack of communication both internally and externally. Most employees at Twitter X didn't know about this until Monday, until when they came back into work and they realized that their entire company had changed. There was no internal buy-in. There was very little, very little communication about how drastic the changes were going to be. And because of that, you have that lack of internal communication strategy being able to work outside of the company. You've got distressed employees. You've got people who have, got this tattooed onto their skin now, and it's now dead and completely different. So there's a lot of these different challenges from, the way that Elon talked to the press to, what kind of communications, press releases, all of these different things that have sort of come out over in sort of the battles every single day on the platform itself have all really made this a very messy, sloppy kind of communication approach that you don't want to model your rebrand off of this, because the shock value alone is not worth all of the challenges and problems that they've continued to have with it. And as we've talked about it, right? There's no value proposition. So, it's the everything app that does nothing new yet. And that's a huge problem because it's a missed opportunity for what could have been a very purposeful rebrand. There's this missed opportunity with it to evolve the surface. And everything from the physical change of the company sign, putting the bat light on the side of the company building as kind of the showcase to the world what this brand was going to look like, to, not being able to scrub Twitter or tweet off of the platform itself on day of, or be able to utilize x.com immediately. Like, all of these different aspects are huge challenges that you need to be really considered in the strategy phase, but we've noticed it here in the execution. Like, it's taking days and weeks for all of these different changes. It's going to take an even longer time for that SEO strategy for all those poor people in the company that have to migrate each and every one of those URLs over to the new domain. So it's crazy to look at all of the different things that have happened in such a short amount of time, when it's a global brand like this that really needed to take the time to look at, what's the pace of change? How are we going to be able to bring our people, sort of with us? And how are we going to be able to tell everybody what this thing's going to be? So the execution alone, it landed flat. It crashed. It was like a bad day at the X Games, right, Nick?
Well, and yeah. Let's not compare Tony Hawk and Elon Musk too closely.
Agreed.
Well, a lot of and everything that we're talking about, and I feel like this sounds just like overused, but all this really comes down to leadership. And I think that the foundation of this a little bit is that Elon, like so many people, and I think everybody here is aware of this at some point, he wasn't really aware, or at least considering the power dynamics at play here. A very strong principle tends to prevent even executive leadership from questioning their decision making. And being aware of kind of the role or the long shadow that you can cast in a rebranding process, really any process, is important. The sense that I got is that he didn't invite anybody to second guess this choice. Like I said, this is somebody who was sitting on this X brand, waiting to use it for a long time, and finally saw that opportunity to kind of jump in. That's always a bad idea, right? We never alone have the perfect answer for this. For really anything, collaboration is important, though, let's not make everything by committee. I say to the universe as a creative director. But the other thing here is that, like, because we wind up in bubbles of our own success, we often don't invite other points of view that are critical. And so the lesson here for CEOs, leaders of companies, is pretty clear. But I would say this is also relevant for really any of us that are kind of at the head of our own department or the head of our own team, is really being cognizant of the long shadows that we cast here as leaders, and making sure that we're intentionally inviting people to question decisions like this, because bad choices like this only happen because nobody was either able to raise their voice or taken seriously to say, are we sure? Do we need to do it in the next 3 days? Like, do we want to take a little more time and get everybody ready? So that's a huge issue, I think, of leadership number one. The second thing is he really contributed to his own bad narrative here. The Twitter transition under Elon started off with rolling layoffs internally. And sometimes that's really necessary. I think, like, we've all been in a place where, nobody likes getting laid off, but there are places where you need to do that for changing dynamics or mismanaged companies. Layoffs are a tool, unfortunately, that need to be used. But when you use them, they can sometimes suggest mismanagement or incompetence. And it's really what happens after those layoffs that determine how people see you as a leader. So when he started to have a really combative tone around his new Twitter ownership to the press, having a combative tone on his own platform, and like Dustin says, not really engaging with his internal kind of employees, that started to really feel like this is mismanagement, like that we're being mismanaged here. And then came that incomplete rollout, right? Then came that dismissal of the community culture. And that changed the whole narrative. That solidified that narrative is this guy is incompetent. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he's really kind of made himself into a villain. Intentionally, I think he's already a polarizing figure. I think that's part of his brand. I think that's part of who he prefers to be. And I get that. There's advantages to that for 1,000 different reasons. But because he made this seem like a vehicle for his own ego, it's really invited people who dislike his personal brand to undermine X or Twitter as a brand more largely, right? So he's really been able to kind of channel all of the bad energy around him, use this Twitter transformation as a means of legitimizing all of his critics, and then giving them all a platform that he literally owns to complain and call out and undermine what he's trying to do. And then the last thing here is really the lack of effort to clarify or add value with the rebrand internally, not getting any buy-in internally at all, is super problematic. His celebrity status, combined with the fact that users of Twitter feel a certain amount of ownership, means that fairly or unfairly, there was an expectation that they would be involved, right? So this isn't a question of employees. This isn't a question of advertisers, right? This is a question of actual users. This is a question of the community, right? They were given no notice about that change coming. That change was never articulated as to the why we're doing this. We want to give you a better experience, or we want to help this stand out better, or there's no articulation for it. And there hasn't been a real vision for the future that aligns with that culture, either the user culture or that employee culture. We know he wants it to be an everything app. That's all we know. There's been no communication about where this direction is going. People are investing in Twitter, in X. They've been invested left and right. They've invested in their time. And when we talk about how consumers use your product, how they use their website, whether you're talking about anything from a social media platform or a bank, like these are all things where people they're deciding how they're going to invest their time opening your app, how they're going to invest their time navigating stuff, whether they're going to invest their time interacting with people on your platform, experts that you have in-house, et cetera, et cetera. People make an investment of time. It's the last thing that they truly feel is their own. And this has turned much of people's lives into what feels like a waste of their invested time into this platform. Now they need to get a new handle. They need to start a new platform. They need to get all new followers on other platforms. The only reason why this app hasn't crashed and burned faster is because the barrier to entry to other platforms is so terribly high. That's the big takeaway here, I think. The barrier to entry for anybody who's on this call, anybody who watches this replay later, all of the clients that we deal with, there is a much lower barrier to entry for somebody to leave your company, your services, your product, and go somewhere else. Half of the mistakes that Elon made would tank any one of the companies that we've interacted with in the last 5 years. So there's really very little room here. But yeah, I've been doing a lot of talking. Dustin, do you have the ability to kind of like give us a little summary, like, of the kind of the big takeaways, then we can open up to some questions.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that, as we always take a look at this, right, in particular, this is such a it's a massive story. It's something on a global scale. It can sometimes be a little difficult for us to sort of take a look and see how can we apply this to what we need to have done, and what are the lessons to actually learn that you can kind of bring to scale. So, I think the first one is really, be better than Elon. I don't think that's like the easiest one for us all to walk away with, right? And you can interpret that in many different ways, but one of the big ways that I'd want everybody to sort of think about this is recognize your individual part as in a rebrand, whether you're an employee, whether you're leadership, thinking about your audiences both internally and externally. Like, you need to really think about those different pieces of it and not let your ego drive any piece of your brand. Like, whether you're all the way back at the very strategic piece or whether you're working in that creative space, like wherever you are when thinking about your brand, regardless of whether it's a huge rebrand or whether it's a small change that you have to make, but you still need to communicate out to your audiences. Really think about those different things and take it as a sort of the cautionary tale of all of this is like, there's a certain tactic, there's a certain approach that Elon wanted to have with this. It had its effect. Its effect is up for debate. So think about how you want to approach those kind of things. Second, of course, the biggest one that we think about here, especially since we work with, different businesses and organizations of varying different scales, is really thinking about your preparation and your pacing. Manage that chaos in pre-planning. One of Nick's favorite sayings is, fix it in pre, is making sure that we solve a lot of the challenges we're going to potentially face after launching or during the launch, because that can also happen too. We got stories. Is making sure that you have a good plan set up for how you're going to be communicating these things, how you're going to be walking through it with leadership, and kind of reminding everybody of their individual responsibility around their branding initiative, whether it's a rebrand or not. And then, of course, choose a proper brand rollout strategy. There's a lot of research and a lot of different approaches to be able to take. Some businesses and organizations need to flip the switch. They need to take all the Twitter birds down and burn everything the day of. That may not be the right choice for you. Really think about, does it need to be one day where everything changes? Does it need to be a phased approach where you're able to really take those distinct milestones on how your brand is changing, how you're communicating it, getting it addressed to people? Or, is it more of a rolling kind of strategy? Like when things are done and out, when the old business cards have been sent, have been used, then we order the new ones. And that's how we're going to slowly do our changes.
And just to jump in quickly on a word for that too, is both of those are right. I think a lot of it has to do with a lot of organizations that we deal with, at least locally in Maine. They have a huge number of branded assets, and they don't have the kind of budget to rebrand all of those assets at the same time that they rebrand. And knowing that in advance allows us to do stuff like do a redesign brand that feels like more of a refresh than a full redesign, so we can retain some of those colors. So even if everything isn't updated at once, you don't have this weird kind of disconnect between your old brand and your new brand. In other cases, what we're able to do is we're able to restructure your budget so that we really make sure that the most front-facing elements are addressed first and the rest of those can come later. There's a lot of ways that you can do this as a rollout, as a delayed rollout. And the reason why I want to say that is because we really talked about Elon's rollout as being super problematic with that flipping the switch. You can do the flip switch just fine as well, but rolling out doesn't necessarily mean to look like what Elon did with like, oh yeah, I'm still using twitter.com, but it's now X, right? So there's a lot of ways that you can fix that so that it looks coordinated and it doesn't look as kind of ill-defined as Elon's here.
Yeah, and communication is a big part of that, making sure it's well communicated each step of the way. And then the last one, and I think me and Nick, we talk a lot about this, especially when we're doing a lot of internal branding with a lot of our clientele. Build consensus internally, bring everybody with you. Know that everybody's going to have a part in your rebrand, and making sure that you have a solid internal communication strategy before you have your external communication strategy. Make sure that your audience in-house is taken care of before you start even looking outside, because that's really where we find the most successful rebrands happen. That's where we have the least amount of changes have to be redacted or things that get messy or sloppy quick, is usually when you don't have your own house in order, when you don't have your own bed made. So really making sure that you have that piece taken care of, and taken care of early, very early in the strategy, is an important piece. And then, of course, this is really, what we always look at for branding, initiatives and projects like this. You got to deliver value with your rebrand. It's an opportunity. It's an investment in an opportunity to try to be able to be able to take care of a goal that your organization has. So, if you're spending all this time and money and effort to try to change your brand, it really needs to pay off at the end of the day. It has to have an effect, a measurable effect you can have at the end of it, to be able to fully justify what you've put into it.
Yeah, and I guess I know we've got a smaller group than usual, given the weather and the vacation and the proximity to school starting and all those other things. But You know, I'm curious if anybody has any observations that maybe we haven't brought up, or kind of any questions that relate to some of the things we've been talking about that maybe feels maybe more relevant bringing it back to Maine. So I'm also comfortable sitting in silence.
Yeah, and definitely would love to hear from I know we have some good marketers on. But one question I have got a couple burning questions. Have we ever seen, I mean, I told, you know, we've talked about this, Nick and Dustin, like we said yesterday, Elon, he's a polarizing figure of, especially, you know, the last year or so, he's been pretty polarizing. I know a lot of people in our industry might think less, you know, might not think as favorable as him. I like Elon. But kind of a question I have is, have we ever seen a bigger branding disaster than this? And this is kind of someone who likes Elon. I just can't think of a bigger branding disaster than or sloppier rollout than what we're seeing here. Do you guys, does anything come to mind?
I always reference JCPenney in 2012 as one of like the key like branding case studies of seeing a giant brand make a lot of mistakes. And this one tops it only because of how quickly it's done and how radically it's changed. JCPenney recovered and tried to try to step back a lot of the changes that they made. I don't think this brand's going to do that. So I think it's going to be one for the ages there, Peter.
And I think it's just a unique situation where we have one of the richest people in the world who's just, he does not that like he has money to burn, but it's, you know, he's got a lot of things going on. And if Twitter does go down in valuation, 10 billion, does it really hurt him? Does it really hurt him that much? I don't know, but it's been really shocking to watch this.
What I would say is I think it's breathtaking. It's in its complete backwardsness. There have been some really bad ones. I mean, the one that stays in my mind is the Gap went from kind of that serify narrow GAP in the blue box. Yeah, they did like this like Helvetica, because everybody feels like modern equals Helvetica, so they went with like a sans serif Gap lowercase with like a little blue square. They added a gradient. Gradients are always a little something for me. I don't know, guys. I'm not a big fan of gradients in logos, but they did it. And the reaction, it was like in 2010, the reaction was so bad that they changed it back to the original one in like 5 days. Yeah. Didn't even try to let it survive. They changed it back immediately. I think Sears had a similar one there that was really problematic. You see a lot of this happen in retail, partially because retail companies are always trying to like chase what is like the new standard, but retail is often experiencing kind of like delayed feedback on things. So you almost always see retail companies getting on board with the thing that just stopped being cool about 6 months ago. And that's not necessarily to say the product, but that is to say the branding. You even see that with how they adapt technology, you know what I mean, with their POS systems, and the fact that like we all should be using like like e-chip readers or like self-checkout on phones like 10 years ago, but they're still starting to like trickle in. So I think I see them in retail companies a lot, but most of it is just, it's bad creative. It's not like terrible rollout and bad strategy and horrific leadership and hemorrhaging staff. Most of the time it is pretty skin deep when it's bad.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I always think about that JCPenney one is the fact that they essentially outlawed the saying of sale. It was in no documents. They completely removed the word sale from the entire brand. And I think that's just it. To me, it's kind of like that piece, right? It's the creative piece we don't see on the surface, but then we kind of notice like they told their staff that they can't use the word sale.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying like, no, we're a high quality brand because we never have sale. Like it's absolutely absurd. I think part of it, and this goes to a little bit about Brett, what you just put in the chat too here, is like the reason for rebranding is like it's all over the place. Sometimes people like just inevitably come to the fact that like, boy, I've had this like 80s metal hair for too long. I should really get a haircut, right? Like it's just like finally giving into the fact that like the shoulder pads are outdated and you need to move on, which is fine. Like there's plenty of times when like that needs to happen. We see that happen in industrial fields a lot later than in other places, you know, where like it really is just about like, can your machine do what I need your machine to do? Great, I'll buy it, right? They tend to be a little late to that stuff. The other thing I find a lot is you'll see rebrands happen as a reflection of a leadership change. So a lot of times you have somebody come in and they want to differentiate themselves from past leadership, whether that was failed leadership or universally beloved leadership, and they want to be able to like move past that. And so you'll see rebrands happening because of that, which is, it's vanity. There's a lot of vanity rebrands happening. I think probably the most successful rebrands are the ones that have some KPIs connected to what success looks like for them. I think having the space to have been doing some A/B testing and seeing what's working and what's not, and kind of coming to the hard terms that like what you're doing isn't really working, is a great reason to rebrand. Sometimes it's that all of your competition is just more successful than you are, and you need the tools to be able to catch up to them, right? I think both of those are really valuable reasons to go in and rebrand. The third one that I would say is sometimes it's your culture has just moved past where you're at. I think we're seeing that happen a lot, particularly as Gen Z has moved into the workplace. I like to remind people that Gen Z isn't just 13-year-olds, they're also 26-year-olds. So, they're among us, guys, like they're in the workforce.
They have money.
Yeah. And they're fundamentally like both them and also some of the cultural remnants of like what happened during COVID, some of the labor-oriented movements that were happening pre-COVID, and we're now seeing happening in a lot of industries now. All those things are changing what cultures are. And sometimes you need to rebrand to reflect that your employees have moved past where you were, or the values that you have, or the way that you present yourself fundamentally frontwards is different. And you want to make sure that that's reflected in either the culture that you are or the culture that you want, knowing that you need to attract a new talent, which is, kind of the hill that everybody's been dying on for the last 3 years or so. The longest possible answer, guys, apologizing. But yeah, I feel like that's
to piggyback off of that a little bit, I think what we find a lot commonly, right, is a lot of it's messaging and positioning. It's just how much you've changed or grown, or how much the market has changed and grown, especially over the last couple of years, which has been crazy when you look at it at a global scale, even in little old Maine. So I think there's a lot to be said about, when you're looking at a rebrand and having it try to be fruitful, what are some of those aspects? It doesn't always have to be something grand. Sometimes it really is just being like, like we've had conversations with a couple of different, manufacturers that are like, well, now we're in a completely different marketplace, or we now have to attract different type of contracts. And it's like that alone, it could be a huge change in language and look and everything, because you're talking to completely different people, even though it's a B2B space and not a B2C space.
Yeah,
that's great. Carrie, I see you're nodding in agreement on a lot of things. Do you have anything you want to add?
So we're in the middle of a rebrand process right now. Ours is a direct result of a merger. 2 logos, 2 brands, 2 identities. And sort of the scenario of the larger of the 2 has now started to kind of, supersede the other. But what we did, or the first phase we just completed, was doing a round of, we hired a company, focus groups, online surveys, cold calls, the whole 9 yards, to determine, because we had assumptions, right? Like, who doesn't? And wanted to know where we stood with those, wanted to know just a whole slew of things. And so they spent a couple months, did the heavy lifting for us, and came back with, you would be absolutely crazy to lose the larger of that merger, the larger entity's name, due to the brand equity that has been built over 40 years. But the logo is not indicative of the area we serve, so that needed to change. But we had, my board of directors got frustrated that we were 5 months really from hearing proposals to where we are with the company selected and the research they've done. But if you don't do that front end work, you might as well just paint a big black X and call it a day, because you're throwing Jello at the wall to see if it sticks. Yeah. So I'm very glad and frustrated it took that long, but it is what it is. It's the first rebrand I've led. It's not the first one I've been in. I was part of Northern Light Health's rebrand throughout the state, so familiar with how that goes. And we're in the same position financially of, since we decided not to change the name, only the logo, do we flip the switch and do everything at once? Well, that is expensive. When you talk road signs, and then building signs and down to business cards. That's a couple $1 million I don't currently have in this year's budget as we come to the end of it. So we're starting where the logo and the name are different, and we'll work our way north to where at least the name is the same and it would only be the logo changing. But we will get pushback. There are people that are so attached to the figure of Paul Bunyan, it would blow your mind. And so navigating that relationship, like the core of who we are and what we do is still the same. So it's communicating that, and we'll still get pushback because they're just grumbly for some reason or another, which I'm still trying to identify. But so making that shift, in that area in the most delicate way we can, just it'll have so much less impact up here. We've all seen, logos come and go. The institutions stay the same, and for most of us it was just kind of you keep going. You just, especially based on the generation, they expect it. Like you said, with retail, they're constantly trying to do. So I don't think with my younger generation it will phase them much of anything. The name is still the same, the icon changed, yeah, cool, moving on. The app is still the same, I can still do what I need to do, and they'll just keep going. But I am not looking forward to changing that in my southern area, because it's not gonna be fun, but that's okay.
It is. I mean, it's funny, like you say, how deeply connected people get to a particular element of a brand, one part of it is to kind of cynically be like, come on, guys. But on the other hand, like it means that like you've been up until this point doing your job collectively very well, that people are like, they look at Paul Bunyan like they'd look at Tony the Tiger, you know what I mean? Like this is like a mascot that they really buy into. I think that's, for me, that presents some of the most fun of a rebrand personally, is because it's all you're in the bonus round, right? Like it's not like this part is going to make or break the rebrand, right? You've identified some of the big stumbling blocks, you probably worked past them. So now it's a question of like, how can we channel what our brand voice is, or like maybe test what that new brand voice is. We didn't talk a lot about brand voice here, but I think it's just so important, right? And like, and find a way to like leverage the voice and the personality of your organization to really make it feel welcoming or playful or warmth, or really acknowledging some of those concerns, and really get to that universal intimacy, right, of how we feel about change, because change was always kind of scary and shakes people loose a little bit. I think that's doubly the case because, the demographics in Maine tend to skew a little older than other states. And so change is always a little bit more challenging, I think, operating here in the state. But that's a place where it's always fun, where you can start to play with, are we doing postcards? Are we doing messaging? Are we doing like, how do we want to engage with this? Particularly because a lot of the folks that you're probably dealing with aren't going to find out about the new logo on Instagram. Right. So it almost makes it kind of more fun to feel like, how do I play with this? Is this like a wedding invitation? A friend of mine recently moved to a new house, and I got a little note in the mail that said your guest room has moved with their new address, which was just felt really warm and lovely. Right.
And
so like to, kind of like give out the free creative in my brain. I feel like that's a place that you can really kind of work from a little bit too. You know what I mean? Yeah. So anyway, it sounds fun though. I mean, rebrands are always exciting and nerve-wracking and high stakes, but it makes you feel alive, which is great when sometimes marketing can really make you feel like that zombie who's going through the motions of, do we have our tagline? Is our logo in the top corner? Are we using the proper colors? Excellent.
Right.
Yeah. So cool.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm actually not surprised by people's appreciation of Paul Bunyan, because I think there's still a statue in Rumford that is still standing 20 feet tall. So I'm very curious of that demo. But yeah, for some odd reason that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
So anything else before we get going, Peter? Anything else on your brain you want to share?
No, I think this was fantastic.